My outline today for you is to first start with the definition of intermittent fasting, and then try to explain a little bit the mechanism of intermittent fasting and how that works in our body, and then move to intermittent fasting and performance. Something is going wrong here. Let's see now. Okay. And at the end of the presentation, we will try to discuss also a little bit about intermittent fasting during recovery from injuries, which is a very interesting topic. We don't have so many data on this, actually no data at all, but we can try to make some suggestions based on what we know about intermittent fasting and injuries in general. So let's start with the definition of intermittent fasting. And if we look in the dictionary what fasting means, we will find this definition. So fasting is a voluntary abstinence from food or drink, especially as a religious duty. But if we look at that on a more medical point of view, the fasted state will be described as a depletion of energy stores, which normally leads to a conversion of fatty acid into the three ketone bodies. So animals and humans have go through their evolutionary story through different amount of food disposition. So sometimes we have abundance, but sometimes we have experienced period of very long food scarcity. And so during fasting or short-term food deprivation, our body has learned how to preserve their body homeostasis. But when fasting starts being too long, the food deprivation leads to starvation, and starvation means loss of homeostasis, which is a big deal for the health of our vital organs. So when we talk about fasting on a health point of view, we always intend a very short period of fasting, also a very short period of food deprivation, which conventionally can be described as less than 2 consecutive days. Everything that is more than 2 consecutive days will lead to the production normally of ketone bodies, which means, for example, ketosis, and we keep going on and on and on, that would be starvation. So for the sake of my presentation today, of course, we are going to speak about the healthy fasting, so everything that is less than 48 hours. As I was saying, in the definition of fasting, we have the religious kind of description of this type of food or dietary intervention. But if, as Marco was saying, intermittent fasting has become very, very, very popular in the last few years, we can find some example of food deprivation or voluntary food deprivation even in the distant ages. For example, the ancient Romans had only one substantial meal, which usually was consumed around 4 p.m. That was called cena, which is the Latin word from dinner. And they really believed that eating more than once per day was unhealthy. The idea that the daily food intake should be divided into 3 square meals, so breakfast, lunch, and dinner, is actually very, very recent. And the introduction of breakfast, for example, in our culture, came by the monks, because that was the meal that was interrupting the night fasting, that they were used to pray and to meditate. And indeed, breakfast literally means break the night fast. And breakfast, for example, has become even more important during the Industrial Revolution because it was the main meal that was consumed before going to work. If we think at dinner instead, the current form and timing became more popular after the widespread use of the artificial light, which facilitated eating before the dark was coming. So the way and the time that we nowadays use to eat and have our meals is really depending of the society and how the environment in which we live. But intermittent fasting finds its roots in religious practice, and probably the most common example of intermittent fasting is the Ramadan intermittent fasting. So during the religious month of the Ramadan, Muslims abstain from ingestion food and liquids between sunrise and sunset. And even though they eat a little after sunset, normally intermittent fasting comes with a caloric restriction. Another peculiar characteristic of the Ramadan is the disruption of the circadian rhythm, because as the participation in the night prayers may delay the time in which people go to bed, and also eating during the dark hours reduce the regular sleep routine, with modest interference also on the hormonal rhythm. So it goes kind of against our biological and circadian rhythm, with the peak and rise of several hormones that normally start in the morning and when the sun comes outside, and basically have the role of prepare our body to the daily work and daily activity. But in general, during the Ramadan, people are able to improve a lot of their body function. For example, blood lipids and glycemic control improves. There is a reduction in circulating insulin, decrease in blood pressure, decrease in inflammatory marker. So all this data has been studied during the years are suggesting that Ramadan intermittent fasting and intermittent fasting in general may be can have a very positive effect on several health biomarkers. And all this observation leads to the development of new or different form of intermittent fasting that have no religion duty inside, but can in some way try to be used to improve health in the other population. And so we can find in the literature different type of intermittent fasting protocol. I'm explaining here the three most common and the three most studied ones. The first one is the alternate day fasting, which is the really most common type of intermittent fasting that has been studied. And during the alternate day fasting, as you can see here in this nice table that Grant Isley put together for us. Normally, what we do is to alternate a day in which people can eat ad libitum as much as they can, with other day in which they only have a single meal, which normally consists in not more than 25% of their normal caloric intake. Data on the alternate day fasting suggests that this regimen can reduce body weight and in particular fat mass, can most of the time maintain the free fat mass and reduce cholesterol and triglycerides. But also data on this type of diet suggests that this regimen can be sometimes difficult to maintain, because the day in which the caloric intake is reduced, people present extreme hunger, and so this is not really feasible, especially for the general population, but also for athletes. The other type of protocol is similar to the alternate day fasting, but it's called whole day fasting. And basically is a protocol that requires people to don't eat for a whole day every 2 or 3 days. So we have 2 or 3 days of normal eating pattern, and then one day in which we have a completely fast, and then again other days in which we can eat all what we want. Combine this type of protocol, combine the intermittent fasting with a real caloric restriction. So the total calorie that normally people should eat during the week is reduced, and it's very difficult to actually abstain for food for a whole day. So some protocol have allowed to actually in the fasting day reduce the caloric intake to 25% of kilocalories. This type of protocol for sure help to reduce body weight and body mass, but we have to say that both alternate day fasting and the whole day fasting is really strictly related to calorie restriction, and so we cannot really define if the results that we see with this type of protocols are due to the caloric restriction or just to the fasting periods that they allow during the week. The last protocol is a less, let's say, aggressive time of intermittent fasting protocol. It's called time restrict eating. And in this type of intermittent fasting, people can keep the same eating routine, so the same caloric intake each day. It's just that the feeding window is reduced. So normally the feeding window will be restricted to 8, 6, 4 hours, depending on the protocol. The most common one is the 16-8, 16 hours of fasting, 8 hours of the time to actually eat all the caloric intake that normally people should eat in their diet. And what we have seen so far is that this protocol is very useful to reduce body weight and fat mass, can keep the muscle mass, and again, it can reduce cholesterol, triglycerides, have a greater effect on insulin sensitivity. And also there are some interesting data that also show that the time restricted eating can reduce inflammatory markers. And for the sake of my presentation, I will refer now on to intermittent fasting, considering the time restrict eating protocol, because it's the only one that can be done without caloric restriction. So we can really look at the effect of fasting and not really on the effect of the restriction of our caloric intake. But let's go now through the mechanism of intermittent fasting that can be in some way divided in two big categories. What happened at a cellular level and what happened in a metabolic on a metabolic point of view. So with the cellular mechanism, to describe the effect of intermittent fasting at a cellular level, we have to think in some way at our cells like a big city with a lot of traffic, in which there are some protein that have the role of in some way make order in the cells. Between all of these protein, PKA and MPK can be considered like a traffic officer. And MPK is the basically master energy regulator of our cells. It detects when energy is sufficient or when we have lack of energy, so there is an energy stress, and it acts activating or deactivating the anabolic pathway to maintain cell homeostasis. To do so, MPK is able to sense the ratio between AMP and ATP. So when this ratio is going down, it means that the energy in our cell is sufficient, and so MPK basically stay at their place, which make the cells able to activate all the anabolic system and an anabolic process, which means that our cells can build up new proteins, can do whatever it needs to do to keep going and keep working. But when the ratio between AMP and ATP is increasing, this is a signal of energy deprivation and energy stress, which will activate NP kinase, which at this point will basically try to activate all a sequence of signaling, which means increasing the sirtuins, phosphorylate ULK1, so activating all the autophagic pathway to interrupt all the anabolic processes and help the cells to preserve energy. So basically, when we are fasting, we are reducing the energy status of our cells, which will activate MPK, which will, as a consequence, basically reduce all the anabolic signaling pathway. So intermittent fasting, with this alternation of long period of fasting and short period of feeding, is a stimulator, a very specific evolutionary conserved and adaptive cellular response that are integrated between organs in order to preserve cell homeostasis. And this type of activation has been shown to improve glucose regulation, so increase and maintain stress resistance of our cells and suppress inflammation. This is all to preserve our cell homeostasis. So again, during fasting, mTOR activity and all the anabolic pathway are inhibited. We have preservation of all the mitochondrial biogenesis and so stress resistance processes, while during feeding, cells is engaged in tissue specific process of growth and plasticity. On a more metabolic level, intermittent fasting can influence what is the regulation made by our circadian clock. So our system and our circadian system consists in different clocks that are present in our body. The master clock is the one that regulates all the signal that actually can control, like a metronome, all the other clocks in the peripheral organs, and its location is in the suprachiasmatic nuclei of the hypothalamus. The master clock is very sensitive to external factors, so our environment, and especially to the cycle of light and dark in our environment. So it's very sensitive to daylight and nighttime. On the other side, we have in each of our organs what they have been called the peripheral clock, which are synchronized by the central signal of the master clock, but they are more sensitive to other type of stimuli, for example, body temperature or hormonal metabolites, feeding and fasting cycle, so eating or not eating, or physical activity level. And inside of ourselves, we still have another type of clock that we call like the molecular circadian clock, and these are very important because they can regulate the transcription of thousands of genes. So the master clock can regulate the peripheral clock, which they can regulate the molecular clock and change what our gene expression are. So if again the circadian clock are more related to the light exposure, the peripheral clock in some way can be modified by our behavior. So the time of the day, for example, in which we eat, or the amount of food that we eat. And this is very important because it puts the peripheral clock in some way in correlation with another type of mechanism that regulates our way to eat and the way that our cells can actually get the energy from food, which is the nutrient sensing process. Food intake stimulates indeed the peripheral nervous system, which through a very elaborate regulatory pathway is evolved to detect the nutrient presence and the energy presence in our bloodstream and the energy status of our cells. So in our cells, we have several specific sensors that can detect the presence of specific nutrients, for example, glucose or amino acid or other type of metabolite. And when they sense the presence of these nutrients, they activate the specific pathway and the specific machinery and inside our cells that use those nutrients in order to produce energy or produce a new protein. And basically, the crosstalk between the circadian clock and the nutrient sensing pathway is what can explain the effect of the time-restricted eating on our metabolism. So when we eat, and when we eat in a regular pattern with defined timing of our meals, basically our circadian regulation, our circadian clock is well integrated with the nutrient sensing. And so when the time of our food is about to come, we start feel hungry, we start feeling the desire to eat, is because the circadian clock is telling our body, look, normally it's time to eat. So get started, have everything ready in order to process properly the energy intake that you're supposed to eat right now. But when feeding occurs at an anticipated time, the integrate anticipatory response driven by the circadian clock and the acute response that actually has been initiated by the nutrient sensing pathway act together, and so they re-regulate themselves. And the next time we will start to feel hungry a little bit earlier because the previous time we eat, the food came way earlier than what we were expecting. On the other side, when the food comes at an anticipated time, all this type of signaling is regulated on the backside. So it's the nutrient sensing that actually is telling the circadian clock that something has changed, and so they have to re-regulate themselves. So you can understand how changing the time of our meal, or like during the time restricted eating, reducing the window of time in which we can eat, will not only change our behavior, but will have a great influence on the circadian clock, which, as you remember, I've explained in the slide before, can change the peripheral clock, that can change the molecular clock. So changing the way that we express our gene, and the way that we feel hungry, and the amount of food that we're gonna eat, and all the metabolism, and which greater effect both on metabolic and cellular level. So time restricted eating, just changing the window of time and the timing of our food, will have a great impact on our body homeostasis. But we want to speak about nutrition in athlete, and so in performance. Nutrition is, of course, important for the athlete. Dietary macronutrient availability is essential for an optimal performance and plays a very important role in modulating skeletal muscle adaptation to training. But we are not going to speak about which type of food, which type of nutrient are important, but the timing on which we ingest this food. And the International Society of Sport Nutrition have speak about nutrient timing, and we have guidelines outside that are explaining which is the best way to organize our meal for our athletes. But here is a few statements that I think that are very important from this position stand. The first one is that nutrient timing incorporates the use of methodical planning. So we have to plan according to each different athletes, depending on the time of their training, the intensity of their training. Is a very precise type of methods that we have to put on if we want to guarantee the perfect nutrition for our athletes. But they're also saying that nowadays we need some extra study to really understand how alter the frequency of our meals, for example, like with time restricted eating, can help our athletes to improve their performance, because we have many data on regular population, but this type of studies are not well integrated for the athlete's need. But there's another, for example, statement that should make us think about the efficacy of time-restricted eating on athletes, because, for example, if we think a daily protein intake, the position stance and all the literature says that to have the proper emphasis on the effect of protein intake on our muscle for our athlete, the protein intake should be evenly spaced during the meals, approximately every 3 hours. So if we think the most common, for example, time restrict protocol that allows only 8 hours of time to eat, the protein spread every 3 hours is a little bit difficult to sustain. So is fasting a good option for athletes? Well, most of the studies looking at the performance and fasting are regarding athletes who observe the Ramadan. However, due to the different type of performance, the different type of sports, and the different type of clinical trial that will be conducting, evidence on intermittent fasting, like the Ramadan intermittent fasting for athletic performance, are not very clear. So some studies are saying that Ramadan fasting is not detrimental, for example, for some type of performance, like the aerobic performance, but can affect the more sprint or power performance. Some other studies are saying that at the end, the performance of these athletes during the Ramadan month are not changed, but the sense of fatigue is way higher. So they can perform as usual, but it takes more energy for them, and it's more stressful for them to get the same results. Some other studies are saying that the performance has been decremented, especially with high intensity training. And so it looks like that intermittent fasting sometimes could not be the perfect regimen for our athletes. But we also have to remember that the Ramadan is not only a reduction of the feeding window, but also change the circadian rhythm. There is caloric restriction, there is sleep deprivation, which really can affect the performance of these athletes. So moving from the Ramadan type of intervention to the time restricted eating, so the, let's say, more Western type of intermittent fasting, we start having some results in these past few years regarding the effect of this type of intermittent fasting on sport performance. For example, Brady and colleague in 2020 studied the effect of 8 weeks of the 16-8 time restricted eating in the middle and long distance runner. What they observed was that the athletes were losing weight, but also muscle mass, and this was primarily due to a reduction of the total energy intake that they were eating during these 8 weeks of intermittent fasting protocol. But despite this loss of muscle mass, their performance indices in endurance running were maintained. And so it was a good turnout for their performance. Our group also studied the effect on the aerobic training, but we look at the effect of time restricted eating on the cyclist. And despite what Brady did in their study, we keep up the amount of protein that they were eating during 4 weeks of time restricted eating. What we observed was, yes, a reduction in body weight, but no effect on muscle mass, because the main driven component that was taking down the body mass was a decrease in fat mass. So we improved body composition of this athlete without affecting any of the endurance training performance. Actually, because the peak power output were kept the same, but the body weight was reduced, we saw an improvement on the peak power out of body weight ratio, which is a very important physical indicator of endurance sports such as cyclists, because the power expressed by an athlete reflects the speed of the race and the ability of the athlete to climb a greater slope, for example, at the same speed. And on the other side, if we have a lower body weight, it means also that the athlete can spend less energy to maintain the same speed, and therefore get less tired during the race. So basically, for our standpoint of view, we think that the time restricted eating in this form for the cyclists were helpful also in performance, because was not changing any of the aerobic capacity index, but was improving drastically their body composition. Another very interesting data that we observed was that we found a decrease in inflammatory markers, and even if it was not really significant, but was pretty impressive, also because they were starting from a normal level of, for example, interleukin 6 and the other marker of inflammation. But we also observe a reduction in the ratio between the neutrophils to lymphocyte, which is a biomarker of systemic inflammation, which is largely used in the clinical practice because correlates with the circulating level of the C-reactive protein. And this is an interesting finding, especially because, for example, the cyclists normally train outside, and at least here in Italy, their pre-season is during the winter time. And so when outside is very cold, and is also that type of period of their training schedule, which is more intense. So if we, in some way, we can keep up their immune system, it means that the athletes are more or less put in the condition of get sick, get any type of respiratory infection or bacterial infection, will means for the athletes to stop their training and to reduce also their performance. If it's true that the time restricted eating can in some way reduce this possibility, is a great advantage. But I would take this data like, just a preliminary data, because we didn't have so many athletes that can confirm these trends, but it's, I think, a very interesting topic, and it will deserve extra research in the future. But we not only observe a positive effect on endurance training, but also on strength sport. So we have studied extensively the resistance training athletes. In this study that we published in 2016, we had a group of resistance training athletes that performed their training during time-restricted eating for 2 months. We observe a reduction in body weight, but a maintenance of the free fat mass in these 3 months. And all the other indices of muscle growth was basically comparable to the group that didn't do the time-restricted eating protocol, but was eating the normal Western diet protocol. Also, on a strength point of view, there was no decrease in strength performance. We were so lucky that a subgroup of these participants agreed to keep going with the time-restricted eating protocol for other months, and they were able to sustain the time-restricted eating diet for 1 year, so 12 months. And so we recently published the follow-up on that study, in which you can see here how the body weight during these 12 months of time-restricted eating was kept decreasing. But also at this point, if we were able to preserve the free fat mass nicely during the second month, we were able also to kind of preserve it during the entire year. But if you look at the effect of the normal diet in these athletes that were keep, of course, training, their muscle mass in 12 months increased of about 2 kilos, which means that with the time-restricted eating protocol, we are not really losing muscle mass, but we are not able to gain extra muscle mass, which is in some athletes can be, of course, not the ideal. On the other side, fat mass was kept reducing, while with a normal diet, it was kept basically always the same. But interesting, even if we were not able to make our athletes to increase their muscle mass in that era of experiment, their strength was increasing in the same way that the subject in the normal diet was improving, they were improving their muscle strength. And I think that is very, very interesting, because these are absolute value of their 1 rem. And so if we normalize their strength by their body weight, of course, that will be even a greater improvement, maybe suggesting the time-restricted eating and fasting in some way have some kind of effect on a neuronal point of view, and we are right now trying to answer to this question. So to summarize, time-restricted eating can help the performance of our athlete in both endurance and strength studies. Is not really impacting the athletic performance, but is improving their body composition, reducing fat mass, and at least maintaining their muscle mass, but is not helping to increase muscle mass. That has to be specified. And so now moving to the last part of my presentation, how can we use intermittent fasting during injuries recovery? Well, it's unfortunately inevitable that during sport practice there is some risk of injuries, and the injuries, when they're even severe, can put the athlete also in the condition of have to underwent to surgery, which normally is associated with a hormonal and inflammatory stress response. It will require the stop from training, maybe bed rest, which of course leads to a loss of muscle mass. And there are limited research on nutrition to prevent or treat muscle injuries, but what we can do, or what of course we know about nutrition in this case, is that the role is to support the healing process, try to prevent the loss of lean mass, and on the same time prevent the gain of fat mass, because of course the athlete is not moving anymore, is not training anymore. It's very difficult to manage because have to consider the change in energy requirement, and also has to put the athlete in the condition of optimize the return to play. So to understand which is the best nutritional strategy during the injuries recovery, we also have to think that injuries recovery can be divided in at least two main phases. The first stage is the real healing and recovery phase. So it takes from immediately after the injuries when the wounds start healing, and it's a very complex stage because it at least involves three overlapping subphases, so inflammation, proliferation, and remodeling. And when the injury is very severe, we also face an immobilization phase. And during this time, all the metabolic change that the tissues is undergoing are the results from inactivity, and so will lead to less of strength, less of functionality, and of course less of muscle mass. So also changes in all the other components like tendons and ligament that, due to the lack of load and training, are of course changing their morphology. The second phase is actually the more type of return to play component, in which we have an increase on the activity of our athlete, and the main goal of this phase, of course, is to put the athlete in the condition to regain all the muscle mass they've been losing and to return to functionality, and at the same time try to keep going with the consolidating the healing process and regeneration of the tissue that have been damaged. So if we think of the role of the time of the nutrition on the first stage, of course, one of the goals is to reduce the excess of inflammation. But what inflammation is, we have to remember the inflammation is a part of the healing process itself. So reducing the excess of inflammation is right, it's okay, but we need that minimal amount of inflammation in order to get the reparation of our tissue. So completely delete the inflammation is not good as well. We know that there are several foods that can, in some way, help on the reduction of the inflammation. I think, for example, at the polyunsaturated fats. But what can time-restricted eating and intermittent fasting do on that? Well, I was telling you before that we have observed a reduction in the inflammatory markers during the 2 months or even more, the 12 months of time-restricted eating in our athletes. And those reductions were significant. But I also told you that with the 4 weeks of intermittent fasting with the cyclist athletes, we observe a reduction of the inflammatory markers that were not really significant. So it seems that on inflammation, time-restricted eating has a positive effect. The problem is that we don't know how long it will take in order to get this inflammatory reduction. So maybe 4 weeks are not enough, and we're going to be late, considering that this first phase of the injuries process recovery is normally shorter than 1 month. It also have to be specified that in our case, what we observed was a reduction in athletes that were not under an inflammation status. So we don't know what really happened when the inflammatory markers are higher. And so we can really say that time-restricted eating is the best process or the best strategies to use, because we don't have really data on this side, but the results are of course intriguing on this point. The other component of the acute phase and the first phase of the injury recovery is the immobilization or atrophy stage. And so the goal here for nutrition is to maintain muscle mass and preserve anabolic response. We have to think that a healthy, inactive muscle generally can lose a muscle in a rate of 0.5% each day. And so these occur normally because there is an imbalance between muscle protein synthesis and muscle protein breakdown. And even if we were thinking for years that the problem was an increase on the breakdown of the process, actually the results now are pretty much all agree that is muscle protein synthesis the major metabolic mechanism behind the negative net balance. And which means that it's necessary to keep on with the muscle protein synthesis response. And this happens with exercise, but if we're injured, we cannot really move, and with a proper nutritional and in particular protein intake. So to do so and to stimulate at maximum the muscle protein synthesis of our athlete, we should increase the daily intake of protein, and so give them at least 1.6 or up to 2.5 grams per kilogram of body mass. We should refurnish them regularly with protein intake, which means 4 to 6 times a day with an adequate amount. We need about 20 to 30 grams of protein to have a maximum stimuli of muscle protein synthesis at each meal. We should give them proper quality of protein, so it has to contain leucine, has to be rapidly digested in order to increase the amino acid availability. And to do so, the best way is also to increase protein ingestion with the first and the last meal of the day before the long fasted period, so at breakfast and prior to sleep. Time-restricted eating is, of course, not helping with this type of schedule because, as we said before, 8 hours of time to eat all this amount of protein cannot be enough. But we have seen that during the time-restricted eating, if we look at the food diet of our subject, protein intake was being kept basically high. So it was around 1.8 grams per kilogram of body weight all the time, even when we ask our subject to keep going for 1 year. So the maintenance of the total amount of protein intake is not a problem with time restricted eating. The big problem is being able to spread this protein with a proper, timing. So several times per day with a 3-4 window of rest between one meal and the other. And this, I think, is a very nice schematics that Williamson and Daniel Moore put up a few years ago, just to show you how the protein synthetic response will act during a time-restricted eating protocol. So the problem is that if we want to apply the time-restricted eating protocol in order to maximize muscle protein synthesis, probably we should provide a greater amount of protein intake, try to split them in the number of meals that our protocol will let us do. We need to separate this meal by at least 3 to 5 hours. So the ideal would be the first great meal with increased protein intake at the very beginning of our feeding window, another snack after a couple of hours, and the final big meal after the 8 hour of feeding period. But this is probably the biggest problem with time-restricted eating during injury recovery. Another important component is the energy expenditure, because depending on the extent of the immobilization, the energy expenditure should decrease, likely because exercise is either more difficult or virtually impossible. But we also have to remember that the healing process requires energy. So on a nutritional point of view, we need to give enough energy to our athlete in order to heal the wound, but on the other side, we want to give them extra energy intake to make them increase their fat mass. And this is a very difficult balance to keep. On this perspective, intermittent fasting, the time-restricted eating protocol is very helpful because we have showed that we can keep the total energy intake, especially if we don't have a longer period of intermittent fasting. We were super able to keep the same amount of total energy intake within 2 months of training protocol, keep going with this type of protocol for longer time will induce voluntary reduction of the total caloric intake. But even if we were keeping the same amount of caloric intake with the same macronutrient distribution, we were able to reduce fat mass. So for this type of problem, time-restricted eating is a perfect strategy, nutritional strategy to preserve our athlete that has been injured during the healing process. Finally, on the last stage, the rehabilitation, we say that the goal is to promote muscle hypertrophy, and we already say that this is not the case with time-restricted eating. So in the rehabilitation or the return to play, we have to have an ample protein and energy requirement, and time-restricted eating is not the strategy that can help our athletes to improve again their the muscle gain. So it's not the best way to help our athlete. So going to the end, my take-home message for you today are that intermittent fasting can be performed in different way, but it's not always a synonymous of caloric restriction. The time-restricted eating, especially in the 16-8 protocol, could be beneficial in athletic performance because it improves body composition without affecting aerobic strength performance. And it could be useful, especially for some athletes in the pre-season, for example, training to try to preserve their immune system and reduce inflammation. On the other side, time-restricted eating is a bit controversial when we speak about recovery from injuries, with some aspects that can make us think that could be useful, but others that are not helpful because it's not helping to improve muscle mass. So I hope you enjoyed the talk. I want to thank you for your attention. Of course, I want also to thank you all my group, which is a great group and helping me doing all this nice research.